The cabin had always been a place of solitude for me. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the distractions of the world, it was where I went to think, to escape. This summer, however, it was no longer mine alone. My niece, Lily, had arrived unexpectedly, bringing with her a whirlwind of energy and life that the cabin hadn't seen in years. At 19, Lily was no longer the child I remembered. She had grown into a confident, self-assured young woman, her presence filling the small space in a way that was both unsettling and captivating. She had insisted on staying for a few weeks to reconnect, as she put it, after a tumultuous year at university. I had agreed, though reluctantly, unsure of how her presence would affect the careful balance of my secluded life. From the moment she stepped through the door, her laughter and warmth seemed to transform the cabin. She moved through the space with ease, her bare feet padding softly against the wooden floors, her voice light and melodic as she spoke about her plans for the summer. I watched her from the kitchen as she explored the cabin, her curiosity unrestrained. She opened cupboards, peered out windows, and even climbed up to the loft where she would be sleeping. Every movement she made seemed to stir something in the air, a quiet energy that I couldn't quite place. The first few days passed in a haze of small adjustments. She rose early, her morning spent on the porch with a cup of tea and a book, the sunlight catching in her hair as she stretched lazily in the rocking chair. By mid-afternoon, she would wander into the woods, her silhouette disappearing among the trees as she explored the trails I had walked countless times before. Evenings were quieter, the two of us sharing a meal by the fireplace as the sounds of the forest filled the air. It was during one of those evenings, as the fire crackled softly and the warmth of the cabin wrapped around us, that I began to notice the way she looked at me. Her gaze lingered a second too long, her laughter softer, more personal. It wasn't overt, but it was enough to stir something in me, something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I told myself it was nothing, a passing thought, a fleeting moment of misunderstanding. But as the days turned into weeks, those moments became harder to dismiss. It was in the way she leaned against the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass as she talked about her day. It was in the way she brushed past me in the narrow hallway, her touch lingering just long enough to make my heart skip a beat. It was in the silence between us, thick and charged, as we sat by the fire each night. I tried to bury it, to push it aside, but it lingered like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. And as the cabin grew quieter, the woods darker, I realized that the line between us was beginning to blur. The boundary I had so carefully maintained slipping further out of reach. The cabin had taken on a different rhythm since Lily arrived. Her presence was woven into every aspect of the day, from the sunlight filtering through the trees to the sound of her soft footsteps on the creaky floorboards. I could feel her everywhere, even when she wasn't in the room. It was as though the air carried her imprint, a constant reminder of her vitality, her youth, her unsettling pull. That morning, the air was heavy with the scent of rain, the storm clouds gathering above the canopy of trees. I had planned to spend the day chopping wood, a necessary chore that often cleared my mind. Lily had insisted on helping, though she'd never handled an axe before. She appeared on the porch just as I was lacing up my boots, her hair pulled back into a loose braid, her face lit with excitement. She followed me into the clearing behind the cabin, her steps light and careful on the damp ground. I showed her how to grip the axe, how to swing it with precision, but it was clear from the start that her strength wasn't suited to the task. Still, she was determined, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried again and again to split a stubborn log. Her laughter rang out every time the axe slipped or the wood resisted her effort, a sound that cut through the tension in the air that I took over after a while, the rhythmic thud of the axe against the wood grounding me in a way few things could. Lily stood nearby, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I could feel her gaze on me, tracing the lines of my movements, the way my hands gripped the handle, the sweat that beaded on my forehead. When I paused to wipe my brow, our eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. The air between us was charged, the unspoken tension hanging heavy. She smiled, breaking the moment, and turned away to gather the split logs into a pile. I watched her as she worked, the way her body moved with a grace that seemed effortless. The damp air clung to her skin, the faint sheen of exertion making her seem more alive, more real. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the task at hand, but the image of her lingered in my mind. The rain started just as we finished stacking the wood. It came down in a sudden burst, the drops cool against my heated skin. Lily laughed as she tilted her head back, her arms outstretched to catch the rain. Her joy was infectious, and despite myself, I found a smile creeping onto my face. She turned to me, her hair plastered to her forehead, her eyes bright and full of life. That we ran back to the cabin, soaked through by the time we reached the porch. She stepped inside first, leaving a trail of water as she moved toward the fire. I hesitated for a moment, watching her from the doorway, the way she seemed so at home in this space that had always been mine alone. The firelight danced across her features as she knelt to add wood to the flames, her expression soft and unguarded. That I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The sound of the rain muffled but persistent. The cabin felt smaller with her in it, the air thicker. I busied myself with drying off, hanging my wet shirt by the fire and grabbing a blanket from the couch. When I turned, she was already wrapped in one, her hands cradling a steaming mug of tea. She looked up at me, her gaze steady, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the rain against the windows. The tension between us had grown, an unspoken force that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. I turned away, settling into the chair by the fire, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and longing. As the evening wore on, the rain continued, the world outside the cabin fading into the shadows of the storm. Lily sat curled on the couch, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the flames. I stole glances at her when I thought she wouldn't notice, the light from the fire casting her features in soft relief. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost dangerous, a reminder of everything I couldn't have but couldn't seem to resist. When she finally stood, her movements were slow, deliberate. She set her mug on the table and turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Good night," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find my voice, and watched as she disappeared up the stairs to the loft. I stayed by the fire long after she was gone, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease the chill that had settled in my chest. The line between us was growing thinner, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it disappeared entirely. The days that followed the rainstorm seemed to stretch endlessly, each one marked by the quiet tension that had taken root between us. The cabin, once a haven of solitude, now felt too small, the walls pressing in with the weight of unspoken words and lingering glances. I told myself it was nothing, that this was the result of too much time spent in close quarters, but deep down, I knew better. That Lily's presence had shifted something in the air. She moved through the cabin with an ease that belied the growing intensity of our unspoken connection. Every gesture, every glance, seemed to carry a weight that neither of us dared to address. And yet I couldn't escape it, couldn't ignore the way she seemed to draw me in without even trying. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds and cast golden light over the forest, I decided to retreat into the woods. The trails were familiar, well-worn paths I had walked countless times before, and I hoped they might offer some clarity. I grabbed my gear and set out early, the crisp air biting against my skin as I left the cabin behind, but even the woods offered little reprieve. The silence was oppressive, the usual rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds drowned out by the thoughts that swirled in my mind. I walked aimlessly, letting my feet carry me deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around me like sentinels. The solitude I had once cherished now felt like a prison, each step only deepening my awareness of what I was trying to escape. When I returned to the cabin hours later, the sun was high in the sky, its warmth doing little to ease the chill that had settled in my chest. Lily was on the porch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees as she worked intently on a drawing. She looked up as I approached, her expression softening into a smile that made my breath catch. "You were gone a while," she said, her voice light but tinged with curiosity. I nodded, setting my gear down and sinking into the chair beside her. "Needed some air," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. She nodded, her gaze lingering on me for a moment before returning to her sketch. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, the way her fingers moved across the paper with a precision and grace that seemed effortless. The afternoon passed in a haze of quiet moments and stolen glances. We didn't speak much, but the silence between us was far from empty. It was filled with a tension that neither of us seemed willing to break, a fragile balance that held us both captive. By evening, the air had grown cooler, and the soft glow of the firelight spilled out from the cabin as we sat together on the porch. Lily leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the last traces of sunlight faded into darkness. The soft curve of her smile, the way her hair caught the light, the quiet strength in her posture, it all made her seem untouchable, yet impossibly close. I looked away, my hands tightening around the armrests of my chair as I fought to steady my thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's so peaceful out here, like the rest of the world doesn't exist." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The truth was I felt the same way. The cabin, the woods, the isolation, it all felt like a world apart, a place where time stood still and the rules of the outside world no longer applied. But that only made the weight of what was happening between us feel heavier, more inevitable that night. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the sounds of the forest filtered through the open window. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the faint creak of the floorboards as Lily moved in the loft above. It all seemed to echo with the tension that had come to define our days. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but it eluded me, my mind too restless to find peace. The next day, I suggested we take the canoe out onto the lake. It had been years since I'd ventured out on the water, but the idea of being surrounded by nothing but the endless expanse of blue seemed like the reprieve we both needed. Lily agreed eagerly, her excitement infectious as we loaded the canoe onto the truck and drove down to the water's edge. The lake was calm, its surface glassy and still, reflecting the sky above in perfect clarity. We paddled out into the center, the silence between us broken only by the soft splash of the oars and the distant cry of a loon. Lily sat at the bow, her hair blowing softly in the breeze, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She looked serene, at peace in a way that made my chest ache. When we reached the middle of the lake, we stopped paddling, letting the canoe drift lazily with the current. Lily leaned over the edge, her fingers trailing in the water as she looked down at her reflection. The sun cast a golden glow over her skin, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. She turned to me then, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless. The air between us seemed to hum with unspoken words, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. I wanted to say something to break the spell, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I looked away, focusing on the ripples in the water as my hands tightened around the paddle. The rest of the day passed in a blur, the weight of that moment lingering long after we returned to the cabin. By evening, the sky was streaked with shades of pink and orange, the sun dipping low on the horizon. Lily was in the kitchen, her movements deliberate as she prepared dinner, and I found myself watching her from the doorway. She moved with a grace that seemed effortless, her focus entirely on the task at hand. When she looked up and caught my gaze, I felt my chest tighten. She smiled, a soft, knowing curve of her lips that sent a shiver down my spine. The silence between us stretched, filled with everything we weren't saying, until she finally turned back to the stove. That night, as we sat by the fire, the tension between us reached its breaking point. The air was thick with unspoken words, every glance, every movement charged with an energy that felt impossible to ignore. I tried to focus on the flames, on the way they danced and flickered, but my thoughts were consumed by her. When she stood and moved toward the loft, her steps slow and deliberate, I felt the weight of her gaze on me one last time before she disappeared up the stairs. I sat there for what felt like hours, the fire burning low as the shadows deepened around me. The line between us had all but disappeared, and I knew it was only a matter of time before we crossed it entirely. The days after that night by the fire became a blur of heightened awareness. Every movement, every glance between us felt charged, as if the cabin itself had become a living entity, breathing with the tension that now defined our interactions. I couldn't escape her presence, not that I truly wanted to. Her laughter echoed in my ears long after she had left the room. Her scent lingered in the air, and her touch, however fleeting, left an imprint on my skin. That morning, the rain had returned, a soft drizzle tapping against the windows as I prepared breakfast. The smell of coffee and freshly toasted bread filled the cabin, but it did little to mask the undercurrent of something heavier. Lily appeared in the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders, her oversized sweater hanging off one shoulder in a way that seemed entirely unintentional, yet impossibly deliberate. She moved toward the table, her bare feet soundless on the wooden floor. I watched her as she poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements unhurried, her focus seemingly elsewhere. She sat across from me, her hands wrapped around the mug as she stared out the window, the rain casting faint shadows on her face. The silence between us was deafening. I wanted to speak, to say something that would shatter the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched her, my gaze lingering on the way her fingers traced the rim of the cup, the way her eyes seemed distant yet aware of my every move. When she finally looked at me, her gaze was steady, unflinching, and it felt as though she could see through every layer of defense I had built. After breakfast, she disappeared into the loft, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I busied myself with chores, hoping the physical labor would ground me. But even as I chopped wood, her presence lingered. The rhythm of the axe striking the log should have been soothing, but it only served as a backdrop to the chaos in my mind. That BY afternoon. The rain had stopped, the sky brightening as the sun broke through the clouds. I found her outside, sitting on the porch swing, her legs tucked beneath her as she sketched in her notebook. She looked up as I approached, her smile soft but knowing, and motioned for me to join her. The swing creaked softly as I sat down beside her, the faint breeze carrying the scent of rain and pine. She closed her notebook, setting it aside as she turned to face me. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't been in years. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes said more than words ever could. The hours passed in a blur of quiet moments and stolen glances. We walked along the trails together, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. She moved with an ease that was both natural and mesmerizing, her laughter breaking through the quiet like sunlight through the trees. I found myself drawn to her in ways I couldn't explain, couldn't justify, yet couldn't resist. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cabin was bathed in the warm glow of the firelight, the tension reached its peak. We sat together on the couch, the space between us impossibly small, yet vast with unspoken words. Her head rested against the back of the couch, her eyes half closed as the firelight danced across her features. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but the weight of everything held me back. She turned to me, her gaze meeting mine with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding, until she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm glad I came here. I needed this." I nodded, my throat tight, as I tried to find the words to respond. "Me too," I managed, my voice rough with emotion. The look in her eyes softened, and for a moment, the tension seemed to ease, replaced by something quieter, more profound. As the night deepened, she moved closer, her head resting lightly on my shoulder. The warmth of her touch, the way her presence seemed to envelop me, was both comforting and overwhelming. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, knowing that whatever came next, nothing would ever be the same. The line we had been towing was gone, erased by the quiet pull that had brought us together. And as the fire burned low and the shadows deepened around us, I realized that I no longer cared about the boundaries we had crossed. All that mattered was her, and the connection that had changed everything. The final days at the cabin carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The air between us was thick, charged with everything that had been left unspoken. Every glance that lingered too long. Every touch that felt deliberate despite its fleeting nature. I found myself restless, unable to focus on the tasks that once brought me peace. The line we had crossed was no longer something I could rationalize or ignore. It was there, a living, breathing entity that followed us everywhere. Lily moved through the cabin as though nothing had changed, but I could see it in her eyes, in the way her movements carried a deliberate slowness, a quiet challenge in the way she met my gaze. She was testing the boundaries that no longer existed, daring me to acknowledge what was happening between us. And I was caught between the weight of my own conscience and the undeniable pull that she had become. The morning was bright, the sunlight filtering through the canopy of trees and casting golden patches across the forest floor. Lily had risen early, disappearing into the woods with her sketchbook. I stayed behind, the quiet of the cabin offering little solace as I busied myself with splitting firewood. The rhythmic swing of the axe against the log should have been grounding, but my thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the moments we had shared and the ones that loomed on the horizon. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed from the cool morning air, her hair tumbling loose around her shoulders. She carried herself with a confidence that seemed to fill the room, her laughter breaking the silence as she set her sketchbook on the table and joined me by the fire. The warmth of her presence was palpable, a quiet hum that I felt in my chest as she settled into the chair across from me. The hours passed slowly, the two of us moving through the day with an unspoken awareness of the tension that lingered in every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands. By afternoon, the air had grown warmer, the scent of pine and damp earth drifting through the open windows. We found ourselves outside again, the quiet of the forest wrapping around us like a cocoon. She led the way down a narrow trail I had shown her earlier in the summer, her steps light and unhurried as she moved through the dappled sunlight. I followed close behind, my gaze drawn to the way the light caught in her hair, the easy grace of her movements. The trail opened into a small clearing, the lake shimmering in the distance, and she paused at the edge of the water, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, her voice carrying over the stillness of the lake. I nodded, stepping closer until I was standing beside her. The quiet between us was heavy, filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. I wanted to speak, to break the spell that had settled over us. But the words wouldn't come. She turned to me then, her gaze meeting mine with a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no uncertainty, and I felt myself falter under the weight of her attention. She took a step closer, the distance between us disappearing, and I could feel the warmth of her presence, the quiet hum of her breath against my skin when her hand brushed against mine. The contact was electric, a jolt that sent every thought scattering from my mind. I didn't move, couldn't move, as she closed the space between us, her touch light but deliberate. The world around us seemed to fade, the forest falling into a hushed stillness as the moment stretched, infinite and fragile. That night, the cabin was quiet, the only sounds the faint crackle of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Lily sat on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her as she flipped through her sketchbook. The firelight cast soft shadows across her face, highlighting the delicate curve of her features, and I found myself watching her. Unable to look away, she glanced up, catching my gaze, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was charged, the tension that had been building for weeks finally reaching its breaking point. She set the sketchbook aside, her movements slow and deliberate, and crossed the room to sit beside me. The warmth of her presence was overwhelming, the quiet intensity of her gaze leaving me breathless. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of quiet moments and whispered breaths, the boundaries that had once seemed so clear, now a distant memory. The fire burned low, the shadows deepening around us, but I was no longer aware of the passage of time. All that mattered was her, the connection that had grown between us, and the quiet understanding that nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the cabin. I woke to the sound of birdsong, the soft rustle of leaves outside a reminder of the world beyond these walls. Lily was already awake, her figure silhouetted against the light as she stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She turned to me as I approached, her expression soft but unreadable. "It's a new day," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that matched the moment. I nodded, my chest tightening as I met her gaze. There was no going back now, no undoing what had happened. But in her eyes, I saw no regret, only a quiet resolve that mirrored my own. The days that followed were different. The tension that had defined our time together was still there, but it had shifted, softened into something quieter, more intimate. We moved through the cabin with an ease that belied the enormity of what we had shared, the unspoken bond between us growing stronger with each passing moment. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a refuge from the world, but a space where we had found each other, where the boundaries of who we were had dissolved into something new. And as the summer drew to a close, I knew that the connection we had forged here would stay with me, a quiet echo of a season that had changed everything.